Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the webinar of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the NC-CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at the NC-CASC. I'm co-hosting this webinar with Heather Yoakum, who is our Stakeholder and Communications Lead. We bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker for today, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. We'll also share the link for that in the chat box shortly. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period. You are welcome to submit your questions and comments through the chat box anytime during the webinar. And now I'm extremely delighted to introduce Dr. Koren Nydick, our speaker for today. Koren is currently the Chief of Resource Stewardship at Rocky Mountain National Park. She has had this position since 2018, and it entails overseeing the park's work on natural and cultural resources, planning and compliance, fire management, and research. Prior to that, she was an ecologist and a science coordinator at Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in California. Before her career in the National Park Service, Koren lived in Colorado for over 10 years, where she also earned a PhD in ecology at Colorado State University and was an executive director of Mountain Studies Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Durango and Silverton in Colorado. I first met Koren in the summer of 2007 at the tail end of my PhD, when she kindly offered me a summer internship at Mountain Studies Institute. That experience helped me enormously to chart a path in a highly applied climate science work. And based on my interactions with her, I have found Koren to possess incredible skills at bringing the world of science, at bridging the world of science and resource management. So Koren, thank you very much again for being here today with us, and please take it away.
All right, Imtiaz, thank you for that introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. Okay, so I have to make sure I can forward these. Okay, so in terms of what I'll be talking about and where my lessons come from, you know, Imtiaz just told you I had time at Mountain Studies Institute, which is a great organization that I definitely give a plug to. And one of the best things I did there, I think, is bring Imtiaz to Colorado. So there you go. But anyway, that's kind of where I cut my teeth on working on climate change initiatives and, you know, getting things rolling during that time period. But the stories I'll be telling today are mainly from Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks and Rocky Mountain National Park. And I will be, this is my roadmap. So basically some just quick background, key science, and then get into a story about Sequoia and Kings Canyon and lessons, story about Rocky Mountain National Park and lessons, and then some conclusions. Okay, so when thinking about what was going on when I was kind of entering the climate change science and adaptation world, in 2002, one of the big things was this global change type drought. You know, we were seeing increased temperatures. The models were more and more telling us that there was agreement that this was the trajectory going on. And then in the southwest, we had this massive pinyon pine die-off. And I know that impacted me a lot and a lot of people, because a lot of people use this picture, but that's kind of one of the things that I started out with. And then the ideas of the emerging climate change risks for forests globally. And just these are some of the key publications that kind of sprung that. You know, at the same time, we were becoming, you know, as a community, we're becoming more cognizant of of fire trends in the Western US. This is a kind of a more recent publication, but one that kind of puts together these trends for 1970 to 2012 in a really nice way. But we were experiencing this, right? And we were hearing results of sort of shorter term analyses along the way about wildfire frequency linked to temperature, the increasing wildfire frequency and area burned in large fires, and the lengthening wildfire season. And a lot of people were who are on the front line, of course, were experiencing this firsthand. And so that is kind of brings me to my first story, which I arrived in Sequoia and Kings Canyon at the end of 2010. And the story I'm going to tell is really focused on giant sequoia and mixed conifer forests. And so just to give you a little introduction. So giant sequoia they exist within the ponderosa pine mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. They are an endemic species. They tend to grow in the wetter areas within that forest type. They are highly fire adapted. It's hard to find a giant sequoia without a fire scar. They have a short fire return interval and a low mixed severity type of regime. Sequoia seedlings depend on fire for their growth conditions, and mature sequoia trees are one of the most highly resistant trees to fire and beetles that there is. These areas have been subject to fire suppression fuel loading, like a lot of forested areas in the West. These trees can live up to 3,000 years old. They're huge, old, and awe-inspiring, and people love them. Just real quick, in California and the Sierra Nevada, the groves are here in this dark red color. They're disjunct groves in a very narrow band. There are some farther north, but most of them are here next to Sequoia and King Canyon National Parks and the adjacent national forests and a few other land types. And I'll jump right into the story. So 2011 to 2014, I was immediately engaged and leading some, coordinating some climate change adaptation planning projects. And I'll tell you a little bit about these. So one we called Alternative Fire Futures. And here are some of the participants. And this was really about re-examining fire management in the face of climate change and looking to produce tools, processes, and collaborations for implementing a changed approach. And it was interagency and looking at a larger landscape scale besides just those parks. And then kind of right after this, we jumped in, and this is for the, for the national parks I worked for, we jumped into a giant sequoia forest pilot project, and it was really aimed at integrating climate change into resource stewardship planning. And the goal was to have this climate smart resource stewardship strategy pilot that eventually would lead us to a broader climate smart resource stewardship strategy, which we did get to. But for this pilot, geospatial decision support tools were a big part of it. And, I'm not going to go into any of this in detail, but just say we use a lot of different types of methods. We had narrative scenarios that were based off of some of the modeled projections. We had climate change effects modeling, a variety of qualitative and geospatial vulnerability assessments, values and feasibility geospatial assessments, geospatial mapping that went along with it, lots of expert input workshops, and effort in prioritization and triggers, asking the questions of what, when, and where. And as climate smart conservation was kind of just coming just coming in towards the end of this, but we were already re-examining our goals as well as actions, which is a big part of climate smart conservation. So one of the key questions for Sequoia and Kings Canyon is, you know, in the context of climate change, should we be looking at where we do prescribed fire differently? And prescribed fire is sort of one of the most powerful tools that those parks have for a lot of reasons, but it does take 2 to 3 treatments to restore the forest structure. The fire promotes growth and survival of sequoia seedlings, as I mentioned. It reduces, of course, the fuels that increase the severity of wildfires and maybe reduces the risk of tree mortality from drought. You know, that's kind of a ongoing research topic. And in terms of, you know, where to do this, we put effort into coming up with this framework that really these decisions are based on the values of the areas. They could be ecological or social values, different kinds of vulnerability, including climate change, big part of it, but other types of vulnerability, and then also feasibility. And, you know, we came up with indicators and actually mapped this. And, you know, the pictures you saw before, these are workshops where we have our interdisciplinary experts, you know, from universities. This guy was the within a fire organization at the time, really looking at these maps to help, and then we would have them actually have to prioritize treatments. And so we did different kinds of workshops like that at different sort of landscape sizes. We did find out that is actually useful in real decisions, because we decided to put forth one of these areas to compete for this Department of Interior Resilient Landscapes funding that was available at the time. And, you know, we picked this project area called the Grant Grove Peninsula area, and it has multiple different sequoia groves as well as the areas between them, adjacent interaction with other landowners. And the reason why we thought, let's do something big here is there were very high values in that area, both ecological and social. There was high climate exposure, modeled climate exposure in some of the area. There was sort of a mixed vulnerability based on sort of the fire conditions, the existing conditions, and then moderate to high feasibility. So we actually applied it. One interesting thing, so in the narrative scenario outlooks, you know, in the more near-term one, which was 20, maybe 30 years, really when we were doing qualitative changes, as many of these scenario planning exercises go, really it was like moderate changes in climate and the forest, you know, changes to mainly the other species. There were some impacts to sequoia regeneration that were, you know, in our scenarios that were concerning. And the different scenarios had sort of different flavors of this. But, you know, in general, we thought that mature giant sequoias will persist similarly to today. And then the more severe changes and impacts to sequoias were farther out. We did understand that extreme events were wildcards. And we did talk about drought and wildfire and drought and insect outbreak and also floods. And I will say that almost as soon as the so-called ink was dry on these scenarios, we were living them. And some of these actually things happened that were in here. We had no idea that we were going to get this wild card right away. And it was actually already starting as we were doing these exercises. And so what happened? The record-breaking drought. So it was building up as we were doing these exercises, and then bam, these unprecedented conditions of this, you know, hot climate change type drought were in our face. And, you know, then we started seeing observations. There were in the park and in the larger landscape, we had pines, firs, and cedars dying from drought and beetles starting in about 2014, really. They were in the montane forest that this was happening. And the way that drought was sort of thinning out the forest was not the way that fire would have. And so it wasn't sort of a surrogate for fire effects. And by 2016, the US Forest Service counted about 66 million dead trees in California. And then the first inklings that all was not well with the mature giant sequoias happened in 2014 when when some of our folks started noticing, namely Nate Stevenson was the first one to seeing the foliage drop off of some giant sequoias. And there were a lot of variability across the landscape. And so in 2015, part of my time was switched from thinking about all these things, thinking about drought and planning for drought and planning for these scenarios, to actually studying it. And so we started this project, Drought Vulnerability from Leaf to Landscape. It was basically asking the trees themselves how stressed they are at a hot drought. There were components that was multi-species, others that were focused on giant sequoias. But the idea was that we came up with an experimental design with some direct measurements of drought stress in the trees, and then also partnered with Carnegie Airborne Observatory, they were called at the time, and for remote sensing, and to come up with indicators that could be linked to the field measurements and give us sort of assessment at a larger spatial scale. And so this is just an example of this type of thing. So through their spectral analysis, they can actually pick out which trees are giant sequoias. Those are the colored ones. The gray ones are other species. And then the color is the climate, the canopy water content, which is one of the indicators we were looking at. You know, the blue is the wetter trees, and the orange is the lighter trees. And this is just showing examples for giant forest, one of the more popular groves. And then, you know, if you're interested in this, sort of partway through this, we published a series of papers in forest ecology and management. And that was actually right as I was moving over to Rocky. Okay, and then, so that was a surprise. And then here's another big surprise. You know, we had talked about beetles that maybe interacting with climate could sort of increase their activities in giant sequoias. But basically to this point, giant sequoias were thought to be impervious to beetles, in that they wouldn't affect them. And we started seeing this Phleosinus, that's the cedar bark beetle that we actually had in our scenario, in giant sequoias, and in giant sequoias that were living, they were still living like this one, but on the way to death, basically. And we would cut these bolts, while our tree climbers would, from UC Berkeley, would cut the bolts, and we would incubate them and see what emerged. And lo and behold, the Phleosinus. And this was devastating, but also incredibly scientifically interesting. And yes, so beetles killing sequoias. So in following up with my colleagues who are back there, so the research chief that's still there, Christy Brigham, they've counted 33 beetle-killed sequoias found in the park to date. They think there are a lot more outside of the park. That doesn't seem like very much, but it is a big surprise, like the tip of the iceberg, because we don't think this ever happened before. And that there are complex interactions, drought and various environmental factors, which we explored, leads to certain levels of stress, symptoms in the trees. But in some cases, if you add in Phleosinus, And along with extensive fire damage, like previous extensive fire damage, in some cases you can actually kill these mature trees and they die standing up. And they tend to happen in the lower elevation drier areas, as you might expect. But this was a surprise, also higher elevation wetter areas. And we came up with this spoiled tree hypothesis that they didn't, like along the edges of meadows, wet meadows, and some water courses or drainages, they, like this one, they didn't develop as extensive root systems. And when the drought came along, they were basically high and dry. And so there's, you know, some new findings coming out soon in ecological applications, but the research is ongoing. They've developed this great team. They're looking at the genetics of the beetle. Is it the same one that attacks incense cedar? What do the beetles do when they're not killing giant sequoias? Can we trap the beetles? All these things to really understand, to be able to actually potentially react to this new stressor. Another surprise. So between 2015 and 2020, there were, you know, some fires, as you might guess, in this part of the Sierra Nevada. And we're starting to find, and this really kind of happened after I left, that what we call the monarchs, the big giant sequoias, were actually dying in these fires. And that was not unprecedented, but it was very, very rare previously. And so 2015 rough fire, this happened while I was there, 26 monarchs in that pretty big fire, although most of it was outside the park. Then in 2017, a few smaller fires outside the park, but again, significant numbers of monarchs died. And then in 2020, they had the Castle Fire, which was a lot in the forest, but some in the park. And it was a pretty big fire. And they think there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of monarchs dead on the landscape. So here's a little bit about the Castle Fire. There were 22 sequoia groves burned. 12 of them were in the parks. And in some areas, there were really these unprecedented high severity effects in the groves, where, you know, all species of trees are just torched, including the mature giant sequoias. They tend to be on warmer, drier, south-facing slopes, and no recent fire, either wildfire or prescribed fire. It was about 13% of the grove area in the park, so it was significant, just from this one fire. And as I said, just in the park, probably hundreds of large sequoias destroyed. In other grove areas, there was a mixed or moderate severity result, or a limited fire spread. That tended to happen on cooler, more moist north-facing slopes, as you might expect, or where there was recent fire. And so when talking with the resource chief, you know, we had been talking about prioritization for a number of years, but that she felt now it's even more urgent because lack of treatment has consequences. We're actually seeing that on the landscape. So where you don't treat, you have a bigger chance of losing. But understanding vulnerability doesn't tell you what to do where. That's a key thing. And we keep on coming back to it because these are hard decisions. For example, you can protect sort of these higher value areas regardless of their vulnerability. You can protect the lower vulnerability or potentially refugia areas more as an insurance policy. Or you could just do what's most feasible so that the most acres can be accomplished. So there are lots of different approaches that you can take, and there isn't really a framework on this among the agencies. And so really it's these place-based experts, decision-making, that's really looking at both ecological and social consequences to make these hard decisions. So some of the lessons from that first story, I call it urgent, interactive, and complex. Climate change interacts with other stressors. producing accelerated, amplified, and highly complex and sometimes unprecedented effects. And basically, it's going to break your assumptions in some cases. It broke mine. And what we need is adaptive management on steroids. So it demands nimble and robust science, innovative multi-pronged methods, and really thoughtful decision-making like I was talking about. And there's never enough resources to do this for everything we care about. And so, yes, that takes you back to the prioritization: what, where, when, how. All right, so I'm going to move on to my Rocky Mountain National Park story, which is the same, some ways same, but also very different forest story. So in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, the forest is, most of the forest area is subalpine. It has long fire return intervals, and the natural regime is a stand replacing fires during major droughts. And the fires in the park in our fire histories are about 4,000 to 9,000 acres. You know, here's one around the popular Bear Lake around 1900. Here's a picture of a, you know, stand replacing fire. There is a small amount of ponderosa woodlands along the wildland urban interface with Estes Park. And that does, of course, have shorter fire return intervals and a lower severity regime. It's, you know, for those of you who live around here, this is no surprise, but, you know, we have a extensive landscape scale beetle-kill impacts in the subalpine forest. So in California, it was very interesting. It was really focused on the montane species. Here it's subalpine. And, you know, here in Colorado, there was an earlier start to these infestations. So these are graphs for Colorado as a whole, but the park followed similar patterns. That the mountain pine beetle, which in Rocky Mountain National Park, it attacked mainly lodgepole pine and limber pine, not ponderosa pine. And, you know, it's really started going up around the 2000s. And, you know, between 2005 and 2011 was the, you know, the major pulse, and then kind of tapered down after that. But then what came in was spruce beetle. So a little bit higher elevation, bigger trees. And that started increasing, and it decreased, but I'll tell you, here in the park, we're still seeing a lot of effects from the spruce beetle. We're still having a lot of die-off in the park. So that's going on. And then I also just wanted to mention the 2012 Fern Lake Fire, which was a winter story. Now, I wasn't here in Rocky when this happened, but I heard about it and it was kind of alarming. So with this fire, which was on the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park, it started October 9th here in this red spot in Forest Canyon. And, you know, over the next few weeks, it you know, advanced up the canyon. Then it, you know, kind of a month later, it advanced again. And this is in the fall. And some of this, you know, there's snow happening and things like that. And then while there was snow on the ground in early December, in a wind event, this thing made a massive run towards past Cub Lake to across Moraine Park. And this is what Moraine Park looked like before, you know, as the fire was coming. And just a note that this Moraine Park used to be a willow beaver riparian ecosystem. It used to be a much wetter system. And I'll get to kind of the whole wetland piece of this in a bit. But this fire, even with snow on, it ran right over it. And basically the firefighters were able to hold it at the road, which is why it didn't go into the sort of major park infrastructure or into Estes Park. So that happened in the winter under snow. And so basically this is a National Geographic from 2019. So we're kind of, this is kind of like the landscape. We've got this dark brown is these beetle-killed areas that are, you know, in the subalpine of the park. We're starting to, you know, get fires occurring again after suppression, and they're becoming more difficult to manage. And this article also talks about invading grasses, and that's what the purple is. So this is also cheatgrass. So cheatgrass has also been moving uphill, and it's projected to keep on going, which will be really unfortunate, you know, that that happens, but it's part of the story here. And then came 2020, okay? And I do like this graph from the Colorado Sun and how they put it. For large fires, 2020 is its own epoch in Colorado. So this is, you know, the wildfire area and different fires in 5-year chunks. So 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. And here's 2020. And this is not all of it. This was written October 19th. The East Troublesome fire hadn't even jumped the divide yet. The Cameron Peak fire was still going. So this even got bigger. And so just to tell you some more about these fires, which I'll be talking about, Cameron Peak fire became the largest fire in recorded Colorado history. And that's recorded history, not going back farther in tree rings. And it goes way off this page, and most of it was in Forest Service and private lands, and a little bit in the park. The amount in the park is not unprecedented, you know, 7,500 acres. It's kind of on the lines of what we've seen in our fire histories. The fire behavior, a bit of a different story. East Troublesome fire, you know, came pretty close. It's the second largest fire now in recorded Colorado history. It started in October and went about 2 months before it was contained. Cameron Peak started in mid-August and went almost 4 months before it was contained. They just couldn't get around it. The thing got so big that it kind of overwhelms the capacity. And there's a place where the, you know, wind comes and it slips out. And 21 for East Troublesome fire, we got 21,000 acres. That's getting pretty big for what we know about fire histories in the park for fires, you know, like twice. And, you know, over 9% of the park burned, even though most of these fires were outside the park. So just kind of, just real brief, like some of the impacts. And I will say that one of the reasons why these fires were unprecedented is probably not, we don't know if their size is unprecedented going back thousands of years, but we do think the behavior could be, and certainly in the experience of managing the park and managing fires in Colorado, and also the fact that, you know, those fires hundreds of years ago didn't occur with a bunch of massive human infrastructure on the landscape and lots of thousands of people out there in these communities. You know, the amount of people that were on the landscape at that time was less, and less infrastructure. So there were evacuations of Grand Lake and Estes Park communities, about 35,000 people, I think. Hundreds of structures were lost in Grand Lake. Sadly, 2 people did die. And 26 structures within the parks were destroyed. They were mostly historic, including some iconic buildings. The Grand Lake Cemetery was damaged. Lots of roads, trails, wilderness campsites burns, produced a lot of hazard trees. Hundreds of archaeological sites burned over. Burned wildlife exclosures, limber pine stands, and wetlands. We saw fish kills and potential or maybe even likely flooding, debris flow, exotic plant spread, and wildlife habitat changes are expected. And most of these things, the only reason why, you know, these fire effects are so looked at so negatively is because of the infrastructure in the way, because we've been working on these exclosures and growing the willows in them, because limber pine are already stressed by other stressors, and same with the wetlands. That's really what's going on. So why was this fire the way it was? And, you know, there was widespread severe drought. So the drought was due to this hot and dry summer fall. And so here's just a, you know, drought monitor image for October. Also, but I will say it was due to hot and dry summer fall, despite a pretty good snowpack. And so this is an interesting graph. It's the energy release component, or ERC. It's basically the like a composite of fuel moistures, and it tells you something about the heat that would be released at the fire front should these fuels burn. And you know, it's from April to October, and measured from 2005 to 2020, actually. The red is the maximum for that time period. The gray is the minimum, and then it's comparing it with 2020. And you can see, like, early in the season, it was an unprecedented low, and it increased rapidly, but was still on the lowest end. And then in July, started bumping up, you know, lots of variability. And then in August, and this is when the Cameron Peak fire began, it got into unprecedented territory, at least for the time of measurement. Then we had a big decline. We actually got a snow event that put a pause on the Cameron Peak fire. And but then rapid drying, really rapid drying. And this is into October. This is where the Cameron Peak fire took off again, and shortly after the East Troublesome fire began. Oh, and I will just say, you know, we didn't get the monsoon moisture that is more typical. And so, you know, what happens with the monsoon moisture under, you know, future climate has very big impacts to a lot of things, including these fire regimes. The Beetle-Kill fuel regime. So there's lots of different opinions and results of how, you know, Beetle-Kill forests sort of affects flammability and fire behavior. You know, there's been research that says when the trees are in the gray stage, it really doesn't affect the fire regime. But I just want to point you to something here, that we still have, if you look closely, there's still live trees in the canopy. There's still a lot of fuels in the canopy here. We also have standing dead trees, but there also is a ton of down trees. And you can see in this close up right here, there's tons of fuel above, there's tons of fuel below. And so I think in this situation, I think what we saw, and the, you know, research will play it out, is that this did play an important role in these fires. Also, a key factor was extreme wind. Here, this is for the East Troublesome fire on the Grand Lake side of the park. It actually snapped these trees, these lodgepole trees. Gusts were up to 60 miles per hour. And the fire grew more than 120,000 acres and traveled over 18 miles in a day on October 21st. That was the day it entered the park. You can see the fire plume there. It jumped the divide shortly after, which was 1.5 miles, which blew people's minds. And it got me thinking about the seasonal distribution of wind speeds. You know, anyone who lives up here, we know that in the summer, we have lower wind speeds. And once the fall gets going, as this graph shows, with the higher wind speeds, where there's more probability of getting those higher wind speeds. And so another question is, what's going to go on with the wind regime here? Because that is key to how, the interaction with climate change. And a late fire season here, and this is totally not the case for Sequoia where there's not much wind, but a late fire season here equals more wind. And so, you know, this article is showing that the 2020 fire season was also unusually late. And we know that the fire seasons are expanding. But this, in particular in 2020, a lot of the fires in Colorado started late, went late, including the ones I'm talking about. And so it was a perfect storm. We had severe drought, dead and down beetle-killed trees, high winds. What I didn't talk about is poor humidity recovery overnight, which I think is related to the winds and the drought. And from the INSAWeb description, that produced unprecedented wind-driven active fire behavior with rapid spread. And so I gotta speed it up here on time-wise, but I did want to talk about fire severity. So this did result in big areas of high vegetation burn severity. So the above ground vegetation, big areas where it's torched. But interestingly, the soil burn severity tended to be low to moderate. And so here's a picture of the soils. The top organic matter is charred, but there's still root structure, soil structure in there. It's not hydrophobic. And so basically lots of vegetation effects, but it's basically just charring the top of the soil. And that is good news for fire recovery. And so that was part of the burned area emergency response team that I worked with. And then also they developed soil burn severity maps. So from a number of data, including those soil samples, and just showing you that both for the west side and the east side, it's really mostly high and low severity for the soil. There's also modeling of flooding and sediment delivery post-fire that was done. This graphic, I don't have time to go into, but it's showing the part of the west side of the park where we anticipate the more severe effects, although again, it's not nearly what it would be if the soil burn severity was high. And this actually, I will say that this actually helps us focus different actions that we aim to take to mitigate some of these risks. This is debris flow estimates from a USGS model, same type of thing. One question I have, and we don't have a lot of capacity to monitor this, is what will be the actual flooding, sediment delivery, and debris flow occurrence and the effects of that. It's a really important, we'll be experiencing of it, but actually, you know, analyzing it is a different story. Lots of questions about fire effects and natural recovery, forest recovery in general. You know, we have beetle-kill, non-beetle-kill. We have high severity, lower severity. We have a lot of different variables in here, species that are very interesting to tease out. Limber pine recovery, we are concerned that this species already stressed by beetles and white pine blister rust doesn't have that as much capacity to recover. So we are concerned about that. Willow recovery inside and outside of our wildlife exclosures. The exotic plant spread affects the water quality, aquatic habitat, and fisheries. Wildlife habitat, forage, and prey base, and the effect on cultural sites. Okay, so I did want to address what the park did before the fires. Because we have a very strong fuels program in the park. And this is the east side, as an example, the east side of East Troublesome Fire. These yellows are fuel treatments. This gray is the Fern Lake Fire footprint. And so we think that the fuel treatments were really important to help in the management of the fire. They helped stop the fire in some areas. It went around other areas, and they could have come into play had the weather change not happened in other areas. And so, but there's much more to do. We do have a master fuel plan. It's a lot different than Sequoia and Kings Canyon in that it's basically like this barrier approach because of the type of fire regime we have, where our fuel treatments protect the infrastructure in communities along the WUI on both sides of the park. In the subalpine forest, here we have lodgepole. We do thinning, which is not an ecological surrogate, for a stand replacing fire, but it reduces fuel loads for protecting, life and property. And in the ponderosa pine, we try to do prescribed fires when the prescription allows us. So in the last 10 years, there's been about 3,000 acres treated. We are asking, what is their efficacy? Do they work? We are also rethinking those subalpine field treatments because we know it's not an ecological surrogate. And we're looking at treatments that are designed to promote a field transition to aspen. And that offers lower flammability, high biodiversity, and aesthetic and tourism value. A key challenge is to how to overcome the high elk browsing that we have in the park.
Koren, a quick time check.
Yeah, I need to finish up. So I will speed through this, but basically, instead of acting as fuel breaks in these recent fires, our meadows have burned. And this is the Kaiwanichi Valley, burned right up to the Colorado River there. And I think part of that is extreme fire behavior. Part of that is this loss of wetland functioning over time. Lots of different factors going into this. One of them is the elk and moose herbivory. And that using methods to restore riparian wetland that are already in use, but just thinking about that, this can actually be a fuel treatment. And there's lots of different goals that we can meet with restoring these riparian areas, and including the fuel break, including drought resilience. And what is climate change doing? It's making it much, much more urgent with climate change, and the clock is ticking. So I'm finishing up. There are many climate change interactions and issues in Rocky Mountain National Park. I just talked about one. Climate change is sort of at the center. It interacts with all these other stressors. And there are many stories we could tell, or that we'll be learning about in the future. Some of the things that I see is like I said, the increased urgency to act. What we need to do to really understand and make choices about what, when, where to resist or increase resilience or to accept change. Reducing other stressors or restoring ecosystem integrity, that's still one of the best tools that we have. And again, adaptive management is just really emphasized in this, where we are. And then I always encourage people to look for multiple benefits for these projects. And again, the prioritization is key and hard. So of course, collaboration and partnership is essential. I just wanted to put some of the partners that I've worked with in all these endeavors, and then I will finish up and see if there are any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Koren. That was amazing. Covered a lot. And we have a few questions. Before I get into that, I just want to point out we had record attendance for our webinars today. So it's very exciting. Something about the topic, something about the speaker, I believe. Let me get into the questions, and I'll also allow folks to ask themselves later on, but I'll start with the question that were posed in the chat box earlier. I'll start with Jake Wilson, who has a few questions here. On the Beetle-Kill, does it appear that prior burn scars are an entry to beetle attack? Would the mechanism be a mechanical weakness or physiological weakness?
I don't know. I would love for you to tell me. It could be. Mm-hmm.
Well, Elisa also had something on the Beetle-Kill. How is causality versus correlation parsed?
Say again, how is?
Causality versus correlation. I'm just wondering, yeah, Elisa, would you like to? Well, she's just asking, I believe on the Beetle-Kill issue, how do we understand causes of the causality versus just correlation?
Oh, of the beetles, the increase in like the beetle infestation itself or its effect on fire regime?
Yeah, and
I don't.
Well, let me, Elisa, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, well, I'll move to the next question, and Elisa can ask it another time. And Jake has another question. In the castle fire images, the high severity effect image seemed to show a high density of smaller poles that may have promoted the ground fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are long fire return interval forests, but because of fire suppression, we have a lot of areas that are really ready to burn, that are pushing or beyond their fire return interval. And so, yeah, I think we have some densification, and then also the Beetle-Kill effects. Lodgepole pine here in Colorado, they do tend to grow quite close because it's like a wind firming effect because they have shallow roots. But I do think that could be part of the story in some places. For example, Forest Canyon above where the Fern Lake Fire burned, higher elevation.
Question from Gregor. It's amazing and seemingly a testament to the method that the scenario planning process nailed it in terms of beetles switching from one species to another. I guess talking about the pine to the spruce. Can you tell us a bit about the scenario planning process in terms of encouraging this out-of-box thinking and how this played out in your group's process?
May I clarify quickly, MTS?
Go ahead, please.
I was talking more about the beetle switch onto sequoias.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the sequoias there had been documentation of those of Pleiocynus on dead branches of sequoias, but there had never been any documentation of them having an effect on live trees like they had on cedars. But we don't actually know if they're different species or not. So that's part of the science that needs to be developed. But I guess by thinking about things like that ahead of time, it helped us be on the lookout to even be looking for things like that, because those things are very subtle until they're not, right? 33 dead giant sequoias from Beetle-Kill, there are hundreds of thousands of them. They're rare, but there are 100,000 of them, and you need to be able to find these things early to have any chance of addressing them. And I think that's probably how that really helped us kind of react faster and even know about it.
Okay, well, we have 4 more questions. Hope to cover them. Regarding the East Troublesome fire, is there evidence of fires ever previously crossing the continental divide? Does this affect future planning for large fires?
Mhm. We don't have evidence. That's not to say it couldn't have happened. You know, if a fire occurs on both sides of the divide in the fire history, but there's really not evidence of it, and it blew everyone's mind. It's kind of like in the rough fire back in Sequoia when the fire jumped a certain road. No one predicted that. It blew its mind. And then the continental divide is just like magnitudes more. And so it's like something that we need to be aware of. And think the way that the spot on the east side was caught was actually, there was like a heat source caught by, I think it was the National Weather Service. And they gave a phone call to our fire management officer, and then he sent out people to look, because we had no idea it was on the east side. And if we, and by that kind of hard work and just attention is why we had a little bit more warning for the east side and evacuating Estes Park.
So when you talk about moving to aspen fuels, is that an intentional directing of change in ecological condition away from historical conditions, or is that a restoration of past conditions?
That's an excellent question. We're only going to be able to promote aspen. We're not talking about planting aspen where they haven't ever been. But we actually think that there's aspen clones under the ground in a lot of places, but they've been suppressed because of this lodgepole pine forest. And so it may, in a way, be going back to a historical condition, but we're pushing that we are, the idea is to push that transition. So I'm not really sure, because, would that have happened historically without climate change, if we weren't doing it? I don't know. That one's kind of in the gray area. I'm interested in what other people think.
Okay. Well, since we have 2 minutes, I'll just go to the next 2 questions. From Catherine, what was the impetus for the climate change adaptation planning at SEKI, at Sequoia, Kings Canyon? It sounds like it was a really comprehensive effort, which can be hard to get started.
Yeah, I think I was actually hired for that purpose. The park had a funding line at that time, and people there who were interested in it. That also was in a time where sort of our country was more open to doing, to working on climate change. There was more funding available than, let's say, the recent 4 years. And we knew it was coming, and it's really just interesting work too, to do it. That's not to say that there wasn't pushback from staff. Some staff in land management agencies, they may be like more directed short term. It's like, I'm going to react to what's going on and then do the next thing. I'm going to react to going to the other thing. Other people are longer term thinkers. So it was, there was kind of like bringing them along, some folks, and really showing them sort of the value of taking this approach.
Great. Perhaps we can take the last question here quickly. I'm not sure it's a comment or a question, but says, since beetle genetics are now being researched into, what was used to determine the tree death was a result of beetle activities or secretion? I guess the question is, how would you determine the death was from beetle activities?
Okay, so it's based on the correlation that there were beetles actively, coming out of and living off of the giant sequoias, and then followed by this progression towards death. And that the trees that were actually dying had these beetles. So you could maybe pull that apart a little bit and maybe put in some other methods, but or I propose hypotheses into that, but it's such a strong possibility that this is happening that we're kind of going with that, and the park, you know, is researching it in that way.
Well, thanks, Koren. We just ran out of time. It was really wonderful to have you with us today, and thank you all for joining, and see you next month.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye.